Davison had been at school with Patrick Heron, and after university and a short marriage which broke up, he was feeling very low, and Patrick had invited him down to St Ives, to Eagle's Nest, for a break, and introduced him there to Margaret Mellis, whose marriage was also breaking up, to Adrian Stokes. The pair of them obviously related to each other and got on very well, and Davison, who'd written quite a bit of poetry up till then, found himself in an artistic community and took up painting not long afterwards.
I first met Francis. In fact, I met Francis before even my mother met him. Patrick and Delia Heron had an idea that they both knew Margaret and they knew Francis separately, and they had an idea that these two people might get on. I kind of knew that there was something special about this, because I must have been told something or other. We're going to go and meet this really interesting person, Francis or something. So we got to the station, and as we were simply on the outside of the station was a kind of picket fence between us and the actual railway, the train drew in, and there was this guy sitting in the window a bit like this, you know, and he said, "Is this it? Is this where it is?" or something like that. And then later we walked back to the house and he met Margaret for the first time. So I was a kind of strangely unique position to have actually come across him before and seen him before Margaret.
He went on honeymoon with Margaret to Venice, and they both painted considerably there. You'll see in one or two of these Venetian pictures the same balcony reappearing time and time again. His colours at this stage are very bright, very sun-related, and one could almost say that they could well have influenced some of Patrick Heron's later colour sense, rather than the other way around. I do
think that these eyes in the front of the boat are particularly interesting, and later on with the collages, he used the idea of breaking up a form with sticking another piece of paper in the middle of that form. Just taking that idea that you can break a form up with a smaller form was a very important part of the actual development of the collage.
After the honeymoon, Davison and Mellis went to live in the south of France, and he continued to paint at Cap d'Antibes and a number of these yachts, lighthouses, and almost tropical foliage show the same strong colours that he was using in Venice.
He's now decided, in a way, I'm not going to represent in this. I'm using these shapes, but I'm also going to use colour in an abstract kind of way, and so the colour is extended. It is in the same way as when he started to use collage paper, he managed to get the best he could get out of the colour of the paper.
There are splashes of colour that reappear very occasionally. There's a little oil called Colourful Cottage, which suddenly sings out with those south of France colours, but it's actually set in Suffolk in those early years and is a counterbalance to the muted forms that he's normally producing at that time.
This was of a certain sort of period where he was getting bits of cardboard and covering them and just giving a thin sort of wash of emulsion. And then I think he used Conti crayon. And it was all the Suffolk countryside, basically. I mean, buildings played quite a large part in it. And then he amalgamated the idea of a cottage and the fields. And quite a lot of that work, starting with the black and white ones, but then they went on to those coloured paintings where he started using colour.
It wasn't until he came back to East Anglia in the early 50s, and probably to the English grey climate, that suddenly he was producing almost line drawings on card that sort of echo Ben Nicholson from the same period. The structural linear forms that he created are representational but almost abstract, and it's the way the lines and the shapes interlock that prefigure where the collages are going to come from not long afterwards.
I remember us going for bicycle rides through the countryside. He would get out an old envelope and start suddenly doing something really fast. He also used them for notes and messages and so on. You would do it in a different place. You wouldn't actually do it from left to right, left to right. You would write in the kind of triangular bit something. So in a funny sort of way, you could say something in that shape of the envelope that you wouldn't be able to say in the rectangular bit of the envelope. He might have initially started to use paper simply to be distinctive from Margaret, who was using colour and paint. Under certain circumstances, he would sign it when asked to do so, or when he reached a certain sort of point where someone was buying something and they said, well, please could you sign it? Right, in here, this is where Francis used to work. He'd usually pin up the collage that he was working on that wall here. And there was a bed where all the collages he was working on would be in this corner here. And then the books, basically his collection of books. There's also some more books downstairs. But one of the ways we could identify which way up the collages were was just looking for the drawing pin holes. Because he would absolutely never want to tell anybody which way up it was, you know, anything, any history. It was an attempt to sort of present that particular thing in a particular kind of way for itself, you know.
When Davison first started making collages, the colours he used had that sort of, they still picked up the grey, the black, the brown, the beige, the tones almost of wartime. And again, probably the tones of a damp, wet East Anglia.
But he was fairly limited initially, but when he did discover these different coloured papers, that really, you can really see it in the collage. And I really do think that he really liked working with paper because he felt he could manipulate it, he could make it sculptural, he could do all these different things that he felt he probably couldn't have done if he was working with a brush.
But it's really the way he just juxtaposed those shapes and colours that sing and bring out the glory and the joy and the vivacity and the sort of verve of the later collages. The habit of tearing pieces of collage off and resticking them and moving them around and leaving the torn areas as part of the finished collage was all part of the balance of the image he wanted to present.
They were the bits of paper came away from the other bits of paper on purpose, so that they stood out and there was a shadow. And he was playing with that. He was playing with a dimensional thing related to the paper, the colour of the paper, and a little bit of physicality like in that place there.
It's the paintings that should speak for themselves, or the works of art that should speak for themselves. It's really down to the collage to express everything he wanted to say without him having to give it a title and explain it to anybody. And he was happy for the person looking at it to read into it what they wanted to see.
I mean, he once made the comment, it's not so much you're looking at the collage as the fact that it's actually looking at you. It's a little bit paranoid. He didn't feel there was anything in the activity of doing it that was conscious. It was a completely unconscious process. I mean, at the very end, when he was ill, Margaret was trying to sort of help him, and she said, it's absolutely extraordinary because he was saying, tear it out. And she would do what he asked to do, and he'd say, no, that's useless. He was actually very, very difficult. And as he couldn't do it because his hands were shaking, It was very difficult for her to do, but she did try very hard. She was very good, and he would accept at the very end. But these were like little pieces of paper about that big, which had to be, and the actual dedication to how it should be torn had been so developed at that point that virtually there was no way of instructing somebody. They didn't have that history of doing it like he did.
The Hayward show was really the culmination of Davison's work, insofar as it happened a year before he died, was the first time he'd been in a really public exhibition space as opposed to a commercial gallery space.
That was an amazing strain. I mean, I think doing any kind of show of his work was horrendous for him to do. He couldn't really make that transition of being in the public or putting the work in the public. It had become such a private activity. There was one result of that show at the Hayward, which was that Damon Hirst saw it. And that was before Damon Hirst was known as we know Damon Hirst. And he was blown away, as he put it. But that was such a chance thing. And that's how the connection between Margaret and Damon coming down for a weekend occurred, because he then found out that Frances had subsequently died, and he still wanted to see the work.
It's the harmonic effect, the balance of the colours and the shapes that have no defining outside limits, but spread themselves out across the board and just create their own total harmony. If Davison, as a fairly introverted character, had not retreated to the edge of East Anglia, but had spent a lot more time in London and the West Country, St Ives really being his natural artistic home, it seems highly probable that he would now be at the forefront of European art history